The Mafia boss ordered them to cut the vault open, but the maid knew that one spark would burn every secret inside. Cole Bennett was seconds away from destroying the Iron Saint, the only vault standing between his empire and federal ruin. Armed men waited. The torch was raised. The room held its breath. Then Grace Holloway stood up from the floor and said, "Don't cut it." Everyone turned on her like she had signed her own death sentence. But Grace wasn't guessing. She knew the vault's hidden pressure system because her father had taught her how machines remember. 30 men tried to open the Mafia King's vault and walked away shaken, bleeding, and humiliated. Then a quiet cleaning girl heard something inside that wall of steel. None of the experts could hear her missing Father's song. Maybe you know that feeling too, standing in a room full of powerful people while they look straight through you. That was Grace Holloway, scrubbing marble floors in Cole Bennett's Chicago mansion, while armed men argued over a vault that could bring down an empire. She was not chasing money. She was listening to the machine. Before Grace ever touched that steel, she spent 4 months learning how to disappear. Never look too long. Never speak too much. Never stand in a doorway unless someone calls you in. For a young woman in a cleaning uniform, survival inside the Bennett house meant becoming almost invisible. The estate sat north of Chicago, where the city lights faded and Lake Michigan turned black beyond the windows. The mansion looked like old money sealed behind limestone, iron, and silence. Grace arrived with one suitcase, 3 forged references, and a photograph of her father hidden in her coat lining. Mrs. Vale, the house manager, barely looked at her face. She looked at Grace's plain shoes and cheap resume. "Keep your head down," she warned. "They pay for silence." Grace nodded, as if silence had not already raised her. Silence had raised her. It sat with her in a cold Cincinnati apartment after her father vanished, filling the empty chair at the table and answering every police report no one cared enough to take seriously. Still, Grace had not known how heavy silence could feel inside the Bennett estate, where every room seemed to hold its breath. At night, armed guards moved through the halls with stiff jackets and hidden weapons. She learned quickly that silence was not only emptiness, it could be useful. She noticed everything. The security cameras blinked twice before resetting at 2:15 each morning. A guard named Thomas took 6 sugars in his coffee and forgot to lock the archive room after his 3rd cup. The first time Grace slipped into that archive room, she found a burned ledger page and nearly got caught. Mason's reflection appeared in the dark window before she heard his footsteps. She ducked behind a cabinet, holding her breath while he stood by the door and spoke softly into a phone he should not have had. "Not yet," he whispered. "She has not reached it." Grace did not understand the words then, but she remembered the tone. Mason, Cole is second in command, never entered a room without checking his reflection first, as if threats might appear behind him at any second. Most of all, she watched Cole Bennett. Cole was 34. But the whole house obeyed him as if he had ruled it for 100 years. Always dressed in dark charcoal, he moved with the calm of a man who had counted every exit and expected every betrayal. He rarely raised his voice, which only made him more frightening. Grace first saw him on her second night standing before a portrait of his father, Patrick, the dead king of the Underworld. Firelight touched his face with gold, but gave it no warmth. Cole stared at the portrait as if demanding a confession. Just as Grace stepped in with fresh towels, she kept her eyes on the floor, exactly as she had been told. Cole did not turn, but his voice cut through the room, low and rough. "You knew." Grace stopped near the door. "Yes, sir." He asked if she always walked that quietly. Her grip tightened on the tray, but she answered, "When people pay me to clean, they usually prefer not to hear me." The silence stretched. Then Cole turned and looked at her, really looked at her, not just at the uniform. It lasted only a heartbeat, but it felt sharp enough to leave a mark. "Smart answer," he murmured. A trace of amusement crossed his face and disappeared. "Leave the tray." She obeyed and left quickly. In the weeks that followed, she learned his habits. Cole slept rarely, hated anyone standing behind him, and took his darkest calls in the basement. The basement was forbidden. The staff called it the lower level, but no maid or contractor was ever allowed down there. The elevator required a handprint and a code, with 2 men guarding it at all hours. Grace knew she should not look, but when the halls were empty, she looked anyway. For months, she followed small clues through the house, not with panic, but with patience. That patience came from her father. Aaron Holloway had been a master of delicate mechanics, restoring antique timers and pocket watches collectors paid fortunes to own. Aaron's hands always smelled of brass and oil. When Grace was a child, their kitchen table was rarely used for dinner. It was covered in velvet, tiny screws, and watch cases glowing under a dim lamp. She remembered sitting across from him, watching his fingers work. "How do you know where everything goes?" she had once asked. Aaron smiled. "I listen to the metal. I listen to what it remembers." Grace had laughed and told him metal could not remember, but her father held a broken watch to her ear. "Every machine carries the habits of its maker," he said. "The pressure of their hand. Nobody would notice." Grace listened, and under the silence she heard a tiny, uneven tick. "That's the truth trying to get out," Aaron whispered. He taught her to notice what others missed: a screw turned too tight, a gear filed by a left-handed maker, a rhythm that did not belong. She did not know then that those lessons would be the only inheritance he left behind. The night he vanished, Cincinnati was drowning in rain. Grace was 17. Old enough to know his debts had become dangerous and that his smile was something he wore to protect her. She woke to breaking glass, the sharp pop of a window forced open, then the heavy sound of boots. When Grace stepped into the hall, she saw her father with his hands raised. 3 men in dark coats stood in front of him. One held up a strange brass plate of a saint surrounded by stars. When Aaron saw Grace, his face broke. "Run, Grace," he told her. It was his last command. As an intruder turned toward her, her father lunged and knocked over the lamp. She ran, giving him the only gift she had left: obedience. By morning, Aaron Holloway was gone. The police called it a gambling dispute. Grace knew better. To her father's disappearance was an open door in her chest, and she spent 6 years trying to close it. She worked in diners, pawn shops, and a backroom watch repair clinic, searching for any trace of him. She learned which questions made people nervous, and which secrets were worth protecting. Slowly, the Bennett name began to surface, always in lowered voices. A watch dealer in Cleveland remembered seeing her father with one of Patrick Bennett's couriers. An accountant admitted Patrick had commissioned a mechanical vault no computer could breach. Then, at last, a dying bookie in Toledo gave her the location. It was built beneath the lake house. He told her to forget Aaron if she wanted to live. The bookie spat blood into a cheap napkin and said the Bennetts did not lose things. They buried them. That was when Grace understood what kind of world she had stepped into. Justice was not handed out there. Men like Patrick Bennett bought it, buried it, or used it as bait. So when she crossed the threshold of the Bennett estate, disguised as a quiet housemaid, she left her faith in honest men outside the gate. Cole Bennett, though, would not be simple. He had inherited the empire after Patrick died of a sudden stroke 3 months earlier. To the media, Patrick had been a philanthropist. To the streets, he had been a king. Cole inherited the crown, the crooked judges, and the target on his back. He also inherited enemies his father had never named. Soon the house began to breathe differently. Powerful men arrived red-faced and left pale as ghosts. Unmarked cars lingered near the perimeter, with their headlights off. Grace watched the change and understood that something inside the empire was cracking. Cole Bennett withdrew into himself, becoming quieter, sharper, more dangerous. He paced the corridors late at night like a man calculating the exact price of survival. One morning, Grace found him in the dim conservatory, washing blood from bruised knuckles under a running faucet. He looked at her with hollow eyes and told her to leave. But before she turned away, she saw a heavy antique brass key on the counter, a key made for a lock that did not belong to this century. The head of the key was shaped like a Saint-S broken halo, a symbol she knew too well. Grace felt her chest tighten, but she kept her face blank. Cole noticed the tiny pause. His eyes cut through her as he asked if she recognized it. She lied smoothly and said she only recognized dirt. For a second, neither of them moved. Then he said she was either remarkably calm or very well practiced. Grace answered that there was a difference. From that moment on, she knew she had to be flawless. Cole Bennett did not rule by force alone. He saw things. Mason saw things too, but not always for Cole's sake. Grace caught him twice turning cameras away from the West Hall. In quiet corners of the estate, Grace found pieces of the truth. A burned ledger page, a hidden drawer, a trail that kept pulling her downward. Inside one dusty drawer lay a velvet pouch, empty except for the faded circular mark of a pocket watch the exact size of her father's work. Every clue drew her closer to the basement elevator, and closer to Cole himself. She hated that part most of all. It is easy to hate a monster when he stays faceless, just a name in a dark hallway. But Cole Bennett was flesh and blood. He was capable of sudden, precise violence, yet he carried a strange restraint that made simple hatred difficult. One afternoon, while she worked nearby, Grace overheard Mason whisper that federal agents had raided their operations in Cicero. Cole did not flinch. He said the raid had been planned. He had sacrificed Cicero to expose the disloyal. His father, he said, kept snakes just to watch them devour each other. Cole preferred to know which of his vipers still had teeth. As he spoke, he looked straight up at Grace. The glance was brief but heavy. No accusation, only the quiet promise of consequences. Behind him, Mason's jaw tightened, and Grace noticed his hand close around something small in his pocket. Not a weapon, emitter maybe. He hid it before Cole turned. That night, Grace dreamed of her father's calloused hands chained to a cold workbench, forced to build beautiful mechanisms for men who only knew how to destroy. She woke with his old photograph clutched in her hands, her fingers cramped around the edges as if she could hold the past in place. The faded picture showed Aaron Holloway outside their small shop in Cincinnati. Beside him stood 13-year-old Grace, proudly holding a pocket watch. On the back in his handwriting were 6 simple words, "For Grace, who hears the truth." Those words stayed with her. By morning, tension had settled over the Bennett estate like a storm cloud. The guards doubled, and the iron gates were bolted shut. The staff, as usual, arrogance disappeared, replaced by pale faces and clipped whispers. By evening, Dr. Felix Calder arrived with cases of specialized electronic equipment. Dr. Calder was cold, silver-haired, and elegant in the way of men who believed money could protect them from filth. He bragged to Cole that of all the security systems in the Western Hemisphere, only 3 had ever beaten him. Then he asked who had cleaned the bunker recently, as if dust itself had offended him. Grace was passing the hall with folded linens when she heard it. The basement. The word hit her harder than any alarm. That night, someone requested refreshments below. Mrs. Vale looked at the younger maids, then handed the tray to Grace. Her warning was quiet but clear. Take it down, deliver it, and leave without looking back. The elevator descended slowly, vibrating through layers of reinforced concrete and steel. The farther down Grace went, the colder the air became, carrying the stale smell of cigars and desperate sweat. When the doors opened, she stepped into a fortified bunker. But it was the thing at the far end of the room that stole her breath, the Iron Saint. For 6 years, that vault had lived in her memory like an unhealed wound. It was a massive black steel monolith, trimmed in brass, covered with carved stars and mechanical rings. Every millimeter carried her father's touch. And the design, the way beauty concealed a lethal purpose. Sweat stood on Felix's forehead, proof of a mind coming apart under pressure. Behind him, Cole Bennett stood motionless, a silent judge. Mason leaned against the table with his arms crossed, and a weapon heavy beneath his jacket. Grace set the tray down quietly, unnoticed. That invisibility protected her. As she wiped up a spill, her eyes followed the vault's cold geometry. Felix's confidence had collapsed into desperate muttering. Then a sharp internal click echoed through the room. Everyone froze. Felix stumbled back, terrified. With trembling fingers, Felix removed his glasses and told them the truth. They were one mistake away from total ruin. Mason stepped forward, his control cracking. Felix explained the reality. The vault was rigged with an instant chemical fire. It had not been built only to protect a legacy from thieves. It had been built to burn everything, rather than surrender. Cole stared at the brass door, not afraid but wounded, as if his dead father had reached from the grave and struck him. When Felix tried to leave, Cole blocked him without touching him. The pressure in the bunker turned suffocating. The data sealed inside that steel cage was the last thing keeping the Bennett Empire from collapsing. Those files were the only leverage Cole had left. They kept the city from turning on him and stopped his rivals from tearing him apart. When Felix suggested prayer, Cole gave a cold, humorless smile and said God had excellent taste in silence. He ordered the cutting torches brought in, choosing the risk of chemical fire over the humiliation of defeat. Grace watched the cutting rig roll forward. The smell of fuel spread through the room, bitter and sharp. She looked at the Iron Saint carved into the center of the door, calm beneath its fractured brass crown. Then she noticed the star ring. It was misaligned, not carelessly but deliberately. Beneath the hum of machinery and the pounding of her own heart, Grace heard it, a faint rhythm, ticking inside the steel. 3 beats, a pause, 2 beats, then 1. It was the exact rhythm her father tapped when he was thinking. In that instant, the past was not gone. It was waiting behind the metal, asking her to listen. She was no longer the frightened girl running through the dark. She was the only person in that bunker who understood the sound. As Cole signaled for the cutter to light the torch, Grace stood. 2 words stopped the entire room. Don't T, cut it. The quiet command hit like a match dropped into gasoline. Cole and every armed man in the bunker froze. Cole's eyes locked on her Maid, standing over spilled coffee with a cleaning cloth in her hand. Explain, he said. Grace explained the mechanism as quickly as she could. Cutting the outer seal would change the pressure and shatter the chemical vials inside. Cole stepped closer, stunned, and asked how a cleaning girl could know that. Because my father built it, she said. The truth left her mouth before fear could pull it back. She had spent 6 years searching for this door, guided by grief and small mechanical clues. When Cole asked what her father had designed the vault for, if not to be opened, Grace listened to the steady ticking. He designed it to be remembered, Grace said. The words stayed in the air, heavy and undeniable. Cole Bennett stared at her as if a ghost had risen from the marble floor. Nobody breathed. The cutting torch lowered slightly while fuel hissed through the line. On the security monitors above them, rain washed over the cameras, the outside world carrying on as if nothing had changed. Down in the bunker, Grace stood with the cloth clenched in her hand, aware of every weapon in the room, and of Mason's suspicion burning into her back. Telling the truth had put her directly in the line of fire. Cole stepped closer, slow and deliberate. "You have 10 seconds, he said quietly. "Use the phone, Sophie." Grace forced herself not to look at the guns. Instead, she focused on the mechanics. The outer seal was not decoration. It was part of the lock. Cutting it would cause a sudden pressure drop and break the chemical vials. Felix Calder stared at her, offended and disbelieving, and said she was guessing. Grace turned to him calmly. His sensors, she told him, were on the wrong ring. He had been listening to decorative brass instead of the live mechanism behind the Iron Saint. Felix's face darkened with humiliation, but under Cole's stare, he had no choice but to step back. And Felix sneered that she was only a maid. Something inside Grace went cold. She knew that tone. It had followed her for years, ignored, interrupted, and dismissed by powerful men, just as the police and pawn shop owners had dismissed her after her father disappeared. But being underestimated had taught her where men left openings. She looked Felix in the eye and struck where it hurt. "You dropped the second pin because you forced the lunar ring forward." Felix went pale. Cole's interest sharpened. Felix tried to defend himself, but the room had already changed around him. Cole raised one hand, and silence settled with the weight of disbelief. He stepped toward Grace, bringing with him the scent of cold rain and stale tobacco. "Your name," Cole said. The false papers suddenly felt thin. She gave him the truth. Grace, but her name did not calm Mason. Not understand the inner workings of a vault that had defeated professionals. Mason looked at Cole as if asking permission to remove the problem before it became worse. Grace did not flinch. "Vaults like theirs did not build themselves either," she said. Something shifted behind Cole's eyes. Then, with 2 words search her, he stripped away the small safety she had left. As the guards approached, Grace stepped back slightly, her hand closing so tight her nails bit into her palm. She had secrets upstairs, including a hidden photograph that could destroy her if found. Rough hands searched her uniform, her pockets, her shoes. Shame burned against her skin, but she kept her chin high. They could invade her space, but they would not make her lower herself. When they found nothing, Mason demanded that her room be searched. The threat stole Grace's breath for a second. When they asked what they would find there, she looked at his gun and answered with quiet defiance. 2 uniforms, a simple cot, and a woman who had learned never to leave her treasures where violent men could reach them. Mason, angered, grabbed her wrist. Cole stopped him at once. The order was soft, but it cut clean through the bunker. That brief hesitation before Mason obeyed revealed the crack beneath their loyalty. Mason was not only protecting Cole, he was protecting his own place beside him. Grace pulled her bruised hand back and refused to look like a victim in front of them. Cole saw the red marks on her skin, and for 1 second anger flashed across his face, not at her, but at Mason. And he turned back to the vault and demanded that she explain why 30 of his men had failed. Grace looked at the huge black door, a monument of steel that seemed to grow larger in the bunker's heavy silence. Beneath the brass figures, her father's hidden patterns seemed to hum. The vault spoke in spacing and pressure, not brute force. They had failed, Grace said, because they tried to conquer the door instead of understanding it. Cole asked what she would do differently. She said she would ask it to open. As her hand hovered near the freezing metal, she remembered her father telling her that machines hated impatience and had to be handled with care. This was not a modern digital lock. It was old craft shaped by human fear. A code could be stolen. A person could be forced to speak. But memory was another kind of lock. Cole's shadow fell across her as he asked whose memory was hidden inside the mechanism. It was the one question she could not answer honestly. Staring at the broken halo of the carved figure, she said she did not know yet, hiding the truth of her father's work. Felix, still smarting from humiliation, dismissed her words as poetry. Grace turned on him and exposed exactly where he had gone wrong. Ignored the hollow sounds in the lunar ring because they did not fit his theory. He had forced the central dial and mistaken a warning for friction, triggering the defense system. Her analysis cut the room quiet. Felix opened his mouth, then closed it when Cole looked at him. The men stopped seeing a maid. They saw their only chance. Cole checked the readings on the tablet and forced Felix to admit she was right. The confession hung in the air. When Cole asked how much time she needed, Grace realized what they expected now. They wanted her to open it. Her mouth went dry as he told her that her knowledge made her either valuable or dangerous. In this house, survival depended on usefulness, not mercy. Mason warned that she might be leading them into another trap. Grace defended herself. If she had wanted the vault destroyed, she said, she would have let them cut it. Mason accused her of working for someone else. Her answer came fast, raw, and instinctive. "No one owns me." Cole heard the wound beneath those words. He ordered silence, telling his men to shut off radios and put away phones. As the room grew still, the strange uneven rhythm of the lock became clear. beating like a metal heart. Her father had always called such patterns fingerprints in the machine. Grace closed her eyes for half a second. For the first time in 6 years, she felt as if he might be close enough to hear. Standing near her shoulder, Cole told her to begin with the mechanism behind the brass saints. Grace warned him that one wrong move would trigger the final lock, and she would not be able to stop it. Cole only said, "Begin." In that moment, Cole looked like a man worn thin by the ghosts of his father's empire. He was trapped by a legacy he had not chosen, surrounded by enemies waiting for him to fall. Grace looked at his steady hands and saw no fear there. Then she noticed something else, the way he kept his right hand near his gun. Not because he doubted her, but because he doubted everyone else in the room. She wondered if a man like Cole Bennett had ever been allowed to show fear. Turning to the vault, she said, "I need everyone behind me." Mason protested, but Cole cut him off. "She gives the orders now." Mason's mouth tightened, and for 1 second hate showed through the loyalty. Grace kept her face calm. Emotion would weaken the authority she had only just been given. As the men stepped back, she approached the cold steel. Up close, she saw scratches left by so-called experts who had tried to force the mechanism open. Her wrist still ached from Mason's grip, making the fine work harder. Cole noticed her hesitation and handed her his folded handkerchief. She did not thank him. Trust was too expensive here. She wrapped the cloth tightly around her wrist and faced the vault. When she placed her palm against the cold metal, the bunker faded away. She was back in Cincinnati, in their warm kitchen streaked with rain, watching her father work. "The outer ring is aligned to today," Grace murmured. Felix snapped that of course it was and checked his charts. Grace only shook her head. "You checked the sky, not the grief." Cole watched her, and she felt the weight of his attention without turning around. Her fingers moved over the star ring Orion, Venus, the moon. Her father never made anything decorative, unless it had a purpose. The challenge was not finding a date. It was finding the right wound. The vault clicked its rhythm again. 3, 2, 1. The night they took her father. Her breath caught. Cole whispered, "What is it?" Grace said nothing. If she spoke, her grief would spill out, and she needed steady hands more than confession. She gripped the heavy outer ring. For one terrifying second it resisted, and she shifted her weight downward instead of sideways, remembering her father's lesson. Some things moved only when you stopped trying to dominate them. The ring gave. A deep click rolled through the vault, and every guard raised his weapon, inward like a slow breath through a sleeping giant. Mason cursed under his breath, but Cole stayed silent. Grace turned the dial to a rainy night in Cincinnati 6 years earlier, when she learned how quickly a home could become empty. The final star slid into place, and a soft hiss escaped the vault. The overhead lights flickered. Felix backed away in shock, his hip striking the table. He stammered that it was the vacuum seal. Grace kept her hand steady. "No," she said softly. That's the first apology. Cole looked at her with an intensity that nearly broke her focus. There was no pity in his eyes. Only recognition, the kind that comes from people who know what dead fathers can leave behind. The vault ticked in its slow pattern, 3, then 2, then 1. Grace touched the brass saint at the center of the door. It was warm. Her father always saved warmth for the pieces that mattered. She searched for the hidden release. Behind her, Mason shifted. Grace snapped, "Don't to move." The men obeyed. She felt the bookplate sink as a second mechanism stirred, sounding like chains tightening inside a cathedral wall. Cole stepped closer, his voice brushing her cheek as he whispered her name. Grace kept her eyes forward. "If you say my name like that again, I lose count." He fell silent. Something dangerous passed between them, and vanished before either could name it. Grace focused on the carved saint. Its hand was empty. Her father had removed the blade, turning a warrior into a witness. Grace turned the hand downward. A red light flashed, and the room erupted. Mason drew his weapon, but Cole moved with terrifying speed, slamming Mason's wrist down before he could aim at her. Grace kept both hands flat against the door. Breath caught in her chest as the red light flashed 3 times. The whole world shrank to that crimson glow. She counted silently, 3, 2, 1. The light shifted to calm amber, and a low sigh of air moved through the floor. "That wasn't the third pin," Grace said. Felix went pale. "Then what was it?" Grace stared at the brass saint. "It was checking us." Cole slowly released Mason's wrist. The room stayed caught between terror and awe. Grace looked at her wrapped wrist and saw Cole's handkerchief stained with brass dust. The vault was ticking differently now, like an old melody trying to find its first note. The iron saint no longer sounded like a vault. It sounded alive. Grace kept her palms against the brass as the vibrations traveled through her bones. Behind her, the room held completely still. She could feel every man waiting for the machine to decide whether they would keep their secrets or watch them burn. A faint chime trembled beneath the steel. One note, then another. In that suspended second, Grace forgot the guards, Felix and even Cole standing close behind her. She was not underground anymore. She was 12 years old again, lying on the kitchen floor in Cincinnati, while rain tapped the window and her father worked nearby. His radio crackled softly, and he was humming, the way he always did when the work frightened him. It was not a church hymn. It was Shenandoah, low, slow, and aching with distance, a song about a river and a longing that refused to die. Grace opened her eyes. Around the saint's halo, the inner ring was engraved with tiny musical notes. Some were raised, others sunken. None of it was careless. Her father did not make careless things. Grace touched the first note, then the second. The vault clicked softly. Felix gasped, but she ignored him, hearing her father's voice through the memory of rain. Slow, Gracie. Dante chased the melody. Let it come to you. She pressed the notes, and the brass moved like piano keys, waking a deep resonance inside the steel. The sound was not loud and not exactly beautiful. It was more like a massive music box turning over in its sleep. Cole leaned closer, his voice dry and quiet as he asked what she was doing. Grace did not look back. He hid himself in it, she whispered before she could stop herself. The words were raw, dangerous, and too honest for a room where honesty could kill. She pressed the next brass key. A low chime rolled through the floor as the amber light steadied. Felix muttered that it was impossible. Grace almost smiled. Impossible, she had learned, usually meant the wrong person was holding the tool. The hidden melody continued under her fingers until one note sounded wrong. Grace froze, and the room seemed to hold its breath with her. Her fingers hovered above the cold brass. She remembered how her father always changed one note when he hid a secret. It had been their private game, and he would laugh because she had truly heard him. She found the discordant note. It was not a mistake. It was waiting. Her pressed it down. For 1/10 second, nothing happened. Then the Iron Saint rang. A deep metallic wave surged from the vault, rattling the glasses on the table. Men cursed. A guard crossed himself. Even Mason flinched. The central sunburst turned a fraction of an inch. Cole whispered that she had moved the heart and asked if she could finish. I think so, she murmured. Cole did not challenge the uncertainty, and she appreciated that more than she wanted to admit. Leaning closer, Grace studied the sunburst. It was painfully beautiful. Dozens of delicate brass rays spreading outward, each marked with engravings too fine for ordinary eyes. Greedy, clumsy experts had scratched 2 of those rays. Anger rose hot in Grace's chest as if they had cut her father's own skin, and whispered that he deserved better. Mason scoffed at her for talking to the machine. Cole shut him down. Be quiet enough to let it answer. Grace touched each ray by feel. One pulsed faintly beneath her thumb. The center was no ordinary keyhole. The hollow was too shallow and smooth for any tool. It had been made for bare skin. No scanner, no digital trick, no stolen code, only pressure and pulse. Her father had built the final lock for a living hand. Aaron Holloway had made a door that violence could never open. Only a steady hand that remembered his song. Grace pressed her thumb into the hollow. The brass was warm. Inside, a soft ticking began to match her racing pulse. Too fast, too frightened, the amber light flickered. Felix warned that her heart rate was too high. Grace closed her eyes and tried to steady herself. The moment was too heavy. Her father might be dead. An empire depended on her touch. 30 experts had failed before her. If she failed now, 6 years of searching would be sealed in steel forever. Her pulse jumped. The amber light flashed red and Mason swore. Grace, a hand trembled. Then Cole stepped closer, his chest almost brushing her shoulder. Still careful not to touch the lock, he whispered her name. Without opening her eyes, she told him not to say it like that. He accepted that and leaned close enough for his breath to warm her ear. There is a vault in front of you built by a man who hated simple answers, Cole whispered. Grace swallowed and asked if that was meant to calm her. He said no. It was meant to remind her that she was already standing in the worst of it, and she was still standing. His steady voice became something to hold on to. Grace breathed in, then out. Her pulse slowed, and the warning light faded back to amber. She kept her thumb pressed into place and set her other hand on the outer rays. Opening the vault required balance, not force. Ignoring the throb in her wrist, she whispered that they would turn it on her count. Cole agreed. On 1, the vault ticked with her pulse. On 2, metal shifted deep inside. On 3, Grace pressed inward and turned the sunburst counterclockwise. The mechanism fought back hard. Pain flared through her injured wrist, and her thumb burned against the brass. For 1 desperate second, she wanted to let go, to let the machine snap back, and let every poisonous secret burn with the men who wanted it. Then she remembered her father's gentle hands, guiding hers over a broken watch. Never punish the machine for the man who misused it. She adjusted her grip and forced the turn. Exactly a quarter turn. The response was not a soft click. It was a thunderous rumble of steel bolts drawing back, shaking the bones of the building. Coffee shuddered in white cups, and the surveillance monitors flickered wildly. Overhead alarms chirped in panic, then died at once. Then the Iron Saint exhaled. Icy air spilled from the seam of the door, carrying the old smell of dust, paper, machine oil, and something faintly sweet Grace could not name. No one moved. The huge door opened only an inch, but that single inch proved the impossible was real. Grace pulled her hand back and stared at the deep red circle pressed into her skin. Felix sank into a chair. Mason stepped forward, mockery gone from his face. But Cole was not looking at the vault. He was looking at Grace, whose knees finally began to give way. His hand caught her elbow, warm in a way that felt different from his usual controlled touch. Support, not command. Grace hated that she noticed the difference. In front of her, the massive vault door groaned open with a deep metallic cry as 2 guards pushed it wider. Inside lay the remains of an empire built on secrets, rows of dark drives, yellowed papers, and bundles sealed in wax. Grace stood frozen as guards began unloading files that could ruin families, careers, and entire lives. This mountain of blackmail was Patrick Bennett's legacy, and the cage her father had been forced to build. She stepped forward. Cole's grip tightened in warning, but she met his eyes and whispered that something of hers might be inside. He let her go. In the freezing chamber they called the Iron Saint. The cold bit at her skin, and her shoes slid on polished steel. She looked closely at the brass channels and realized that even under terrible pressure, her father had made something beautiful. The thought hurt worse than the cold. There, scratched into the metal, were 2 small letters, GH. Grace pressed trembling fingers to her lips as Cole stepped in behind her, his eyes following hers. Her father had not only left a mechanical marvel, he had carved her initials in a secret corner, where only someone looking with love would find them. Cole stood beside her in the freezing space and kept his distance. That restraint nearly broke her. Feeling along the seam, Grace found a tiny latch. It clicked open, revealing a yellowed envelope addressed to her. Outside, greed and violence kept moving, but inside that small hidden space, time stopped and traced the familiar handwriting with her thumb. For 6 years, she had prepared herself for the worst: a body, a confession, some ugly truth to match the emptiness in her life. She had been ready for tragedy. She had not been ready for the sudden warmth of her father's hand reaching across time. Looking at Cole, she pressed the paper to her chest and whispered that her father was the one who built his vault. Cole said nothing, but his jaw tightened and his eyes darkened. The silence was louder than a confession. Even when Mason appeared at the door and said the files were secured, Cole did not look away from her. Mason demanded to know what was in her hand, but Cole stopped him with one look. Then Cole turned back to Grace and held out his palm, asking her to show him. A bitter, broken laugh escaped her as she stepped back, clutching the envelope like a shield. She had not opened the vault for him, no matter how badly his empire needed it. To her, the Iron Saint was not a weapon. It was a message from a father to his child. When she spoke Aaron Holloway's name, the truth stood bare in the room. The name fell like a key turning in a lock. Cole froze and Mason's eyes narrowed. Grace understood then that they knew him. She stepped past them and out of the vault. "Give me the phone, Sophia." In the harsh bunker light, the men who had once ignored her now watched her as if she were the most dangerous person there. Holding the envelope tight, she claimed her name and her father's legacy as the creator of their miracle. She stood tall, no longer the invisible cleaning girl, and demanded to know what the Bennetts had done to him. Cole's silence was agony. Grace had always hated silence. Now she understood why. Silence was where powerful men buried their worst secrets and waited for them to rot. Behind Cole, shelves of ledgers sat like bones pulled from a grave. Ignored the blackmail files beside him. Cole's eyes stayed fixed on the name Grace had spoken, Aaron Holloway, and the floor seemed to tilt beneath her. "You know him," she said. It was not a question. Moving toward his jacket, Cole's voice cut through the room. "If you touch her again, Mason, you and I are going to have a problem. That friendship will not survive." The air froze. Mason stopped with his fingers inches from his gun. His face hardened, though for one brief second hurt flickered through before obedience covered it. Grace felt those protective words press close around her. Safety from a man like Cole was never free. Still, her bruised wrist remembered Mason's grip, and she knew the difference between a cage and a shield. When Cole told her to open the envelope, she held it tighter. "No, it has my name on it, not yours." Cole looked at the envelope, then back at her. "I knew your father's name," he said. "I didn't know you existed." The admission hit hard. Part of Grace wanted to scream and demand the lost years back. But Cole did not sound like a liar. He sounded like a man walking through a minefield. Grace slid her finger under the old seal. Inside was a folded page and a tiny brass spring. Her eyes blurred at once. Her father used to tuck springs like that behind her ear when she was small, calling them moon curls, and recognized his hurried, strained handwriting. "My Grace, if you are reading this, then you found the saint. I am sorry I built a door out of your grief, but it was the only path, only you could follow. Do not trust their first story. Patrick Bennett paid for the vault, but he did not kidnap me. He paid my debts and promised me a way out. I believed him because I was exhausted and wanted to come back to you clean. I never made it to the plane." Below that, the ink was smeared by sweat or water. But Grace pieced together the ragged words. "Cross took me. He wants machines that do not just lock people out. He wants cages that lock them in. If you open the saint, Look beneath the secrets. Patrick kept proof because he feared Cross. It is in the handleless iron box. Do not come alone. Do not trust men who build cages. I love you beyond time. Dad, the page trembled in Grace's hands. Beyond time was his old promise to her. Love does test stop because a clock does, Gracie. It waits beyond time. For 6 years she had forced herself to believe he was dead, because hope was a luxury that could eat a person alive. She had wanted the truth, even if it led to a grave. But this letter was not a grave. It was a pulse. Grace pressed the paper to her lips and let out a muffled sob. Cole remained perfectly still. He gave her one human moment in a world built for cruelty. Then Mason broke it. Cross, he muttered. Cole kept his eyes on Grace. Yes. The name chilled the air. Victor Cross was the kind of shadow that made dangerous men go quiet. There's an iron box on the lower shelf, Cole said. 2 men moved immediately, but Grace followed before anyone could stop her. Beneath dusty ledgers sat a small black box built straight into the floor. It had no handle, no hinge, no keyhole, only a flat iron face with one brass dot at its center. Cole knelt and Grace dropped beside him, their shoulders nearly touching in the dim, oil-scented space. She studied the seam. Grief still shook her hands, but machine steadied her mind. No, she whispered, tracing the brass dot. This isn't T, my father's work. S, your father, S. Her fingers found a slight depression. Not pulse, not pressure, submission. A lock built for a ruler. Cole almost smiled. That sounds like Patrick. Grace held out her hand. Your ring. Cole looked at the heavy signet on his finger, a crowned silver wolf set in black stone. My father wore this, Cole murmured. I know, Grace replied dryly. Men like him love turning keys into jewelry. Cole stared at her for a second, then removed the ring and handed it over. It was warm from his skin, a detail Grace hated herself for noticing. She pressed the silver crest against the brass dot and turned it. With a heavy click, the box opened. Inside were a leather journal, documents, and a stack of photographs. Cole pulled them out, and Grace's breath stopped. In one photo, her father sat in a concrete cell beneath a caged bulb. His hair was silver, his face deeply worn, but it was him. Aaron held a tiny gear assembly. Beside Aaron sat a newspaper dated just 3 weeks earlier. Grace touched the glossy paper, and the cold vault disappeared. She was 17 again, hearing him shout for her to run. Then she was 23, staring at absolute proof that he had survived the dark years she thought had swallowed him. He's alive, she whispered. Cole's low voice confirmed it. Yes, the truth broke her quietly. She had spent her life staying silent, so she did not wail. Her shoulders simply folded inward as tears spilled over her fingers. Cole reached toward her, then stopped himself. The distance he left felt colder than touch. She looked up and understood. You never had his exact location, but you had this photo. Cole's face tightened. The photo came through my father's contacts before he died. No address. Only proof he kept from me. Grace stood so fast she nearly dropped it. And you expect me to believe your father was innocent? Cole rose with her. No, he said. He dragged your father into our world. That makes him guilty. But he didn't keep him locked away for 6 years. Victor Cross did. Mason added, Cross hit our transport 6 years ago. Patrick buried it to save face. Grace glared at them. None of you searched for the man who was taken to him. Cole's voice was heavy with regret. We looked, just not hard enough. That admission cut deeper than any excuse. They had searched for a stolen asset because it threatened their power. Grace had been searching for her father. Cole accepted her anger without defending himself, and his lack of cruelty only made her angrier. It was easier to hate a monster than to face a flawed man carrying the sins of his family. Instead of arguing, Cole handed her a worn dark brown leather journal with a faint burn mark near the spine. Grace recognized it as her father's design book and carried it to the table under the harsh lights. To anyone else, the pages were a chaotic mess of gears and pressure locks. To Grace, they were a familiar conversation. Her father had a way of marking things, repeating a shape 3 times. Then breaking the pattern on the 4th. On page 12, she found the first broken sequence gear ratios, shifting from 41-87-72 to 41-88-11. Felix scoffed and called them machine tolerances. Grace did not look up. They saw numbers because they wanted a machine, she said. She saw a map. Her father loved hiding roads inside circles. As she worked, the coordinates began pointing to downtown Chicago. Cole went still when Mason identified the location, the old Marlowe Bank building. The bank was now owned by Victor Cross, through 3 shell companies and a charity foundation. Grace asked what was kept there. Mason admitted it was a front for late-night auctions, stolen art, dirty money, and private rooms where powerful men bought favors without ever touching cash. Grace turned the page and found a detailed cross-section of the foundation. The drawing showed tunnels, pressure corridors, and a reinforced room marked with a locked eye. Her father had mapped a prison. The thought that he was trapped beneath that foundation made her stomach go cold. When Cole offered a quiet maybe, she slammed her hand on the table and refused the word. She had lived on Mabes for 6 years. Maybe he ran, maybe he died, maybe he deserved it. Not anymore. Cole warned her that if Cross was holding Aaron under Marlowe Bank, it would not be a simple rescue. He would be behind layers of security built from Aaron's own designs, cameras, pressure plates, and possibly a kill switch tied to his body. Grace felt her anger drain into fear. Aaron had survived 6 years because a monster found him useful. The cruelest part was clear. The things her father had built to protect others had been turned into cages. The room went heavy. Cole picked up the photograph and turned it over, revealing a small, black stamp Grace had missing Cross inside a circle. His voice dropped. Cross already knows. Grace stared at the mark, refusing to understand it. Cole set the photo down and explained that the stamp was a signature, a warning that Holloway was still captive. With 30 men moving through the estate that night, any one of them could be a spy. Mason promised to lock the house down, but Grace noticed he did not look at Cole when he said it. He looked at the security screens, at the blind spots, at the places a loyal man would protect and a traitor would remember. Security feeds multiplied across the walls, and the estate shifted into siege mode without a word. Grace stood frozen, her hand on her father's journal, realizing that walls meant little when the enemy might already be inside. Everything in Grace screamed to run to Marlowe Bank and tear through the floors with her bare hands. But Cole's warning had found her deepest fear, a kill switch tied to her father's life. Being alive meant Aaron could still be hurt. Cole stepped around the table. "I can get you inside." Grace looked at him. "I don't need permission." Cole shook his head. "You need an army blueprints and someone willing to start a war in a room full of billionaires." Her eyes burned. "And that someone is you." Cole met her gaze. And she asked why. He looked toward the open vault, suddenly tired of carrying a dead man's legacy. "Because my father left me an empire full of rot," Cole said. "And Cross is the man still feeding on it." The collision between them was quiet, but it changed everything. Grace stood before someone whose hands could decide life and death, yet those same hands had shown restraint when she was most vulnerable. She clutched her father's journal like a shield, refusing to let her family become another piece in a rich man's war. Cole warned her that love would not make her bulletproof. It was not cruelty. It was the rule of their world. Before their fragile agreement could settle, Mason arrived with a chilling update. 2 guards had vanished, and their trackers had been dead for 18 minutes. The message on the screen was simple, and that made it worse. 8 words. "Tell Miss Holloway her father still hums beautifully." Victor Cross did not need a long threat. He only needed Grace to understand that no place was safe and that he was always watching. Looking at her father's picture, Grace saw the cost of this shadow war. Aaron was trapped in a terrible in-between, neither dead nor free, while his captors smiled from the dark. Grace did not break. She hardened. Grief settled into something quieter and far more dangerous. Cole tried to warn her about Victor Cross' mind, explaining that Cross built prisons shaped around the souls of his victims. Cole told her she was walking into a trap, that she might be nothing more than a key to her father's final secrets. But Grace's answer shifted the whole conflict. Her father had taught her how locks think. She was not only the victim being pulled through the door, she was someone who could read the mechanism. Cole handled the pieces of her past carefully, and he passed her the photograph. Their fingers brushed, and a dangerous spark of hope moved through her. Hope frightened Grace more than any threat. Believing a Bennett meant stepping onto unstable ground. When she told Cole not to make promises, it was self-protection. He did not offer comfort. He offered a debt. In the underworld, a promise could be cheap, but a debt had weight. Grace understood the difference. As the heavy elevator doors slid shut, the open vault disappeared from view like a tomb that had finally given up its dead. Mason watched Grace with deep unease. In their carefully ordered world, she had become unpredictable. For years, she had been a ghost in that house, unnoticed and easy to ignore. Now she stood in the center of everything. Against her chest rested proof that her father was alive, a truth too heavy to absorb at once. When the elevator doors opened, the household had become a fortress. Whatever warmth it once pretended to have was gone. The staff had disappeared, replaced by exhausted men with weapons under the pale chandelier light. Mrs. Vale's reaction said enough. She no longer saw a simple cleaner. She saw someone caught inside the Bennett family's dangerous drama. Cole took command without raising his voice, giving security orders with absolute calm. Grace followed because in that shifting landscape, he was the only steady point. But she did not mistake steadiness for goodness. Cole Bennett could protect her with one hand and destroy someone else with the other. That was the part she could not afford to forget. At the foot of the stairs, the battle for control happened in whispers. Mason wanted Grace hidden away like a liability. Grace refused to be put in any kind of cage. Vault dust covered her clothes, and her hair had come loose. Yet, there was a fierce dignity in the way she stood. When Cole decided she would stay with him, he acknowledged what Mason did not. She was no longer an object to protect. She was part of the game now. Grace looked at Mason's gun, then at Cole's unreadable face, and understood that safety was only another word men used when they wanted control. Before she could answer, Cole was already climbing the stairs. She followed, Faun. His private study had none of the loud flash of new money. It smelled of cedar, worn leather, and whiskey locked in crystal. A low fire burned behind dark iron, filling the room with controlled warmth. Cole handed Grace a glass of water. She drank, and the coldness cut her throat like proof that she was still alive. Mason demanded they move to the city penthouse, but Grace spread her father's journal across Cole's desk. Under the lamp, the blueprints of Marlowe Bank opened like a wound. 3 sublevels, public service, restricted corridors, and at the deepest point, a circular watchcase vault. That was where Aaron was being held. The mechanism had been built inward, made to compress rather than defend. It was not meant to keep intruders out. It was meant to lock one soul in. When Cole asked about a possible kill switch, Grace turned the page and found a chilling symbol. A heart split by a mechanical gear. Her father's captors had forced him to build a system, tied to his own body, maybe his heartbeat, his temperature, or the weight of his chair. Cole did not pressure her. He only said she would find the weakness. For the first time, someone was looking at her mind instead of her uniform. Mason leaned over the desk and pointed to a private elevator shaft. That entrance is suicide, he said. Grace looked at the drawing again. No, it's an invitation. Cole's eyes sharpened. Grace explained that the shaft was not for guards. It was for guests too powerful to be seen entering Cross's basement auctions. Every Friday, Cross hosted charity benefits upstairs and sold secrets downstairs. That night was Friday. They did not have days. They had hours. Cole made the decision before Mason could argue. They would go to Marlowe Bank as invited guests. Grace would enter dressed as someone who belonged among the rich, not as staff. Mason called it madness. Cole told him madness had opened the Iron Saint. A guard brought Grace civilian clothes, black trousers, a soft sweater, and a warm coat. But Cole added one more thing, a dark evening dress from a locked wardrobe. Grace stared at the dress as if it were another trap. The servant's uniform had been her armor. It had made her invisible, letting powerful men forget she had eyes, ears, and a past. Taking it off felt like exposing a wound. Cole did not force her. He simply said Cross expected a frightened maid. Grace looked at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. She looked pale, furious, and older than she had that morning. When she returned in the dark dress and borrowed coat, the room went still. Cole looked away first, not from disinterest, but from restraint. Mason did not. His stare lingered too long. Grace met it until he looked down. She was done disappearing for men who needed her small. They left in a line of black sedans, rain streaking the windows as Chicago rose around them in cold glass and yellow light. On Cole's phone, Cross sent a live video. Aaron Holloway sat beneath a caged bulb, thinner, older, but alive. When a captor demanded he speak, Aaron stayed silent. Then Cross stepped into frame in a spotless white dinner jacket. His clean appearance only made the rot beneath it more obvious. He touched Aaron's shoulder and Aaron flinched. Grace's hand tightened around the journal until the leather creaked. Cross invited them to his benefit with a smile sharp as polished steel. Then he hummed the first notes of Shenandoah. Grace stopped trembling. She wanted him, afraid. Marlowe Bank glowed like a cathedral built for money. Floodlights washed over marble columns. Valets hurried under black umbrellas. Inside, champagne moved through the crowd, and men who ruined lives for profit smiled beneath chandeliers. Cole entered with Grace on his arm, and for one dangerous second, everyone looked. They did not see a maid, and that made them curious. Cross stood at the top of the staircase, white jacket spotless, silver hair combed back, expression delighted. "Miss Holloway," he said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "You clean up beautifully." Grace smiled without warmth. "You should try it sometime." Cole's mouth barely moved, but she felt his approval. Cross laughed as if they were old friends. He kissed the air near Grace's hand and told Cole his father would have hated seeing a servant become the center of the room. Cole's face did not change, but Grace felt the tension in his arm. Cross was not only attacking her, he was turning Patrick's ghost into a knife. Mason moved through the crowd with 2 guards, scanning balconies and exits. Felix, pale and resentful, carried a case of tools Grace had chosen herself. Beneath the music, she heard the building breathe. Old pipes, elevator cables, hidden fans. Then, under all of it, a faint ticking. Not Aaron's rhythm. Cross's sharp, perfect, too controlled. A machine pretending to be alive. Grace whispered that the private elevator was behind the donor wall. Cole asked how she knew. She pointed to the floor. The marble near the west corridor had been polished more often than the rest. Too many expensive shoes had crossed it after midnight. Cole gave Mason the signal. Mason nodded. But Grace saw something pass across his face before he turned away. Not fear, recognition. The same look she had seen in the archive room, when he spoke into that hidden phone. Her stomach tightened. They crossed the room slowly, pretending to admire portraits of dead bankers. Behind them, Cross continued speaking to donors, but Grace felt his attention following her like a hand on the back of her neck. At the donor wall, Cole removed Patrick's signet ring. The hidden panel opened with a soft click. The elevator descended without music. The deeper they went, the more the building lost its polish. Marble gave way to concrete. Champagne laughter became the groan of machinery. Grace studied the floor numbers that were not numbers at all. Only small brass marks shaped like eyelids. Her father's journal had shown 3 levels. The elevator had 4. Cross had added 1. When the doors opened, they faced a narrow corridor lined with black glass. Cole's guard stepped out first. One fell instantly, pulled into the dark by a wire no thicker than fishing line. The second guard raised his weapon, but Grace shouted for him to freeze. A red dot trembled over his chest. Across the corridor, a speaker crackled. Cross's voice smiled through the static. "Careful, Miss Holloway. Your father hates wasted motion." Grace forced herself to breathe. The corridor was not a hallway. It was a listening device. Every footstep changed pressure under the floor. Every breath shifted sensors in the glass. Cole ordered his men back. Mason whispered that they should shoot the cameras and rush through. Grace snapped that shooting was exactly what Cross wanted. She lowered herself to the ground and touched the seam between 2 tiles. There it was, a pulse line. Not electric, mechanical. Her father's work, twisted but still readable. She crawled forward 1 inch at a time, guiding Cole with her hand. The corridor clicked around them like teeth, deciding whether to close. Halfway through, Felix panicked. He stepped wrong. A blade of glass dropped from the ceiling and stopped 1 inch from his throat. He whimpered, frozen. Grace reached back, furious. "Do not move unless I tell you to breathe." Cole's eyes stayed on her, steady, trusting. Behind him, Mason's hand moved toward his inside pocket. Grace saw it reflected in the black glass. Not a gun, a small transmitter. Her blood went cold. Mason caught her reflection, catching him. Neither of them spoke. Then Mason pressed the device. The corridor lights turned red. Every lock in the level slammed shut. Cole turned slowly, the betrayal landing before any word did. Mason raised his weapon at Grace. "I am sorry," Mason said, but his voice was hard. "This was never about you." Cole's face emptied. "How long?" Mason's jaw worked. "Since Patrick died." Cross offered order. "You offered guilt." Grace understood then. Mason had not betrayed Cole for money. He had betrayed him because Cole was changing. And men like Mason feared change more than death. Cross's voice returned through the speaker, delighted. Cross praised Mason like a loyal dog and told Grace to keep moving. If she stopped, Aaron's chair would tighten. On a monitor ahead, her father appeared, strapped inside a circular steel cage, chest rising under a web of wires. His eyes opened. He saw her. For the first time in 6 years, Grace heard her father say her name. Gracie. The sound nearly destroyed her. Cole moved, but Mason pressed the gun harder toward Grace. "Do not make me choose," Mason warned. Cole's voice dropped to something almost gentle. "You already did." Then the lights went out. In the dark, Cole struck like a blade. A shot cracked, deafening in the narrow corridor. Grace threw herself flat as glass shattered above her. Felix screamed. Mason cursed. Emergency lights flickered back. Cole and Mason were locked together, both bleeding, both refusing to yield. Grace saw the transmitter skitter across the floor. She lunged for it, but the corridor began counting down in clicks. 10, 9, 8. Cross had turned the whole passage into a timer. Grace did not have time to be afraid. She grabbed the transmitter and smashed it against the floor, but the countdown continued. Of course it did. Cross would never build a trap with 1 key. Grace looked at the glass blade near Felix's throat, the red lights along the floor, the monitor showing her father's cage. Then she heard it. 3 beats, pause, 2 beats, then 1. Her father was tapping with his fingers against the armrest. Not panic, instructions. Grace followed the rhythm with her eyes and found the hidden release disguised as a crack in the tile. She pressed it with Cole's blood-slick signet ring. The corridor opened with a brutal sigh. Mason broke free and ran deeper into the level. Cole started after him, but Grace stopped him. "My father first." Cole looked toward the passage Mason had taken, where the stolen files and the proof that could save his empire were disappearing. Then he looked at Grace. The choice cost him. "Your father," he said. They found Aaron Holloway in a round chamber beneath the bank, surrounded by machinery that looked half clock, half torture device. The cage around him was delicate, beautiful, and cruel. Every bar was tied to a sensor. His chair measured his pulse. His wrists were locked into brass cuffs that would tighten if someone forced the door. Grace stepped into the room and stopped breathing. Aaron looked older than the man in her memory, thinner and silver-haired, but his eyes were the same. "You should not have come," he whispered. Grace laughed once, broken and furious. "You told me to run last time. I listened. I am not listening now." Cole stayed behind her with his gun raised, guarding the entrance. For once, Cole did not interrupt love. Grace studied the cage. Cross had built fear into every part of it, But Aaron had left small mercies where he could. A screw turned backward, a brass note scratched beside a hinge, a tiny spring tucked beneath the left cuff. "Moon curl," Grace whispered. Aaron's eyes filled. "You remembered." "I remember everything." Behind them, Cross stepped from the shadows, clapping softly. He had changed jackets. Still white, still clean. In one hand was a dead man's switch. In the other was a black drive. Mason stood beside him, pale now, bleeding from the temple, his certainty starting to crack. Cross looked at Cole first. Cross tossed the drive onto the floor between them. "Your empire, Mr. Bennett," he said. "Every copied file from the Iron Saint. Every judge, every debt, every secret your father used to keep Chicago kneeling. Take it, walk away, and I keep the girl." Grace did not look at Cole. She could not bear to see the answer. Cole's gun stayed on Cross, but his eyes dropped to the drive. In that second, Grace saw the real choice: her father's life or Cole's empire. Cross smiled because he saw it too. Then Cole shot the drive. Plastic and metal burst across the floor. Cross's smile vanished. Mason flinched as if the bullet had hit him. "You just killed the Bennett Empire," Cross said. Cole's voice was cold. "Good." Cross pressed the switch. Nothing happened. Aaron had begun humming Shenandoah, low and shaking, and Grace moved on the second line, not the first. She pressed the moon curl spring into the cuff, turned the brass hinge backward, and struck the left bar with Cole's signet ring. The machine shuddered open. Mason fired into the ceiling, shattering the pressure regulator before Cross could reach the backup switch. Steam burst across the room. Cole tackled Cross as Aaron fell into Grace's arms. For one impossible second, she held the real weight of him alive. And the monitors on the wall switched on at once, showing dozens of hidden vault doors beneath Chicago. Cross laughed through blood. "Your father built one door," he whispered. "I built a city of them." Sirens wailed above as every lock began to wake. Every Mafia boss story is not only about power, money, revenge, or fear. Beneath the violence and darkness, there is often a painful human lesson about choices, consequences, loyalty, family, and the price of ambition. This story reminds us that no matter how powerful a person becomes, no one can escape the truth forever. Hundreds of people, and make others tremble at the sound of his name. But if his heart is empty, his victory is never complete. The Mafia boss in this story represents a man who built his life on control. He believed that fear was stronger than love, that silence was safer than honesty, and that power could protect him from pain. For years, he may have won every battle in the streets, in business, and among his enemies. But the most important battle was never outside him. It was inside his own heart. That is where he truly lost himself. One of the most meaningful lessons from this story is that power without morality becomes a prison. Many people dream of becoming rich, respected, or feared. They think success means having control over others. But real success is not measured by how many people obey you. It is measured by how many lives you protect, how much peace you create, and how much good remains after you are gone. The Mafia boss had money, influence, and protection, but he did not have peace. His life shows us that a person can be surrounded by luxury and still feel completely alone. Another important lesson is that loyalty is valuable, but blind loyalty can destroy lives. In the world of crime, loyalty is often treated like the highest law. People are expected to follow orders without question. Never mean giving up your conscience. A loyal person does not simply protect someone's secrets. A loyal person also has the courage to stop someone from destroying themselves. This story teaches us that loyalty without honesty is dangerous. Real loyalty should be connected to truth, respect, and moral responsibility. The story also shows the heavy cost of revenge. Revenge often feels powerful in the beginning. It gives a person the illusion that pain can be answered with pain. But revenge rarely heals anything. Instead, it creates a chain of suffering that keeps growing. One act of revenge leads to another. One betrayal leads to another. In the end, everyone loses something. The Mafia boss may have believed that revenge would restore his honor, but what it truly did was steal his humanity piece by piece. This is a powerful reminder that forgiveness is not weakness. Sometimes, forgiveness is the strongest decision a person can make because it breaks the cycle of hatred. Family is another central lesson in this kind of story. Many Mafia bosses claim they do everything for family. They say they commit crimes to protect the people they love. But protection without honesty can become another form of harm. A family does not only need money or security. A family needs trust, emotional safety, and love that is not poisoned by fear. If a father, husband, brother, or son becomes powerful but loses the ability to show tenderness, then his family may live in a beautiful house, but still feel trapped inside it. This story reminds us that children and loved ones often pay the price for the choices of powerful men. The Mafia boss may think his decisions only affect his enemies, but every secret, every violent act, and every betrayal leaves a shadow over the innocent people around him. That is why one of the strongest educational messages is this: before making a decision, we must ask ourselves who will suffer because of it. A selfish choice may bring temporary success, but it can create long-term pain for the people we love most. Another meaningful point is the danger of pride. Pride can make a person refuse to apologize, refuse to change, and refuse to admit they are wrong. The Mafia boss may have spent years believing that saying sorry would make him look weak, but in reality, the ability to apologize is a sign of strength. It takes courage to face the damage we have caused. It takes maturity to admit that we hurt someone, and it takes true character to change before it is too late. The story also teaches that redemption is possible, but it always requires sacrifice. A person cannot simply say they have changed. They must prove it through action. Redemption means accepting responsibility, protecting the innocent, telling the truth, and sometimes losing everything that was built on lies. For a mafia boss, redemption may mean walking away from power, exposing corruption, saving someone he once endangered, or choosing love over control. The path to redemption is painful, because it forces a person to confront the worst parts of themselves. But it is also the only path that can lead to peace. From a human perspective, this story is powerful because it shows that even the hardest heart can still feel pain. Behind the cold eyes of a mafia boss, there may be regret, loneliness, childhood wounds, or a deep fear of being betrayed. This does not excuse his actions, but it helps us understand that broken people often break others when they never learn how to heal. The educational value here is important. Pain should not become an excuse to hurt people. Instead, pain should become a reason to grow, to seek wisdom, and to choose a better path. For viewers, the lesson is not to admire the criminal lifestyle, but to understand its emptiness. The suits, cars, mansions, and power may look attractive from the outside, but behind them there is often fear, guilt, and loss. A life built on violence can never bring true happiness. A life built on lies can never bring true freedom. And a life built on fear can never create real love. In the end, the story of a mafia boss is really a warning. It warns us that every choice has a consequence. It warns us that money cannot buy peace. It warns us that fear cannot replace respect. It warns us that revenge cannot heal a wounded heart. Most importantly, it reminds us that the greatest power a person can have is not the power to control others, but the power to control themselves. The deepest lesson is simple but meaningful. Choose character over pride, love over control, truth over silence, and forgiveness over revenge. No matter how dark a person's past may be, change is possible when they are willing to face the truth. But the longer someone waits, the higher the price becomes. A mafia boss may win the streets, defeat his enemies, and build an empire, but if he loses his soul, he has lost everything. True strength is not found in violence. True strength is found in responsibility, compassion, humility, and the courage to become better before it is too late.